We're joined on Insead Knowledge by Piyush Gupta. You are CEO for DBS Bank, the banking group based in Singapore. You've been talking here at Insead about the problems that banks are facing at the moment worldwide. Asia, though, is doing pretty well. So how do you see DBS developing? You've only been in the job for about 10 months, but what's your take on it?
We believe that, like many Asian banks, DBS is in the right place at the right time. We think as the center of economic gravity shifts from the west to the east, this is just a fantastic time to be in this part of the world. So we've crafted a strategy for DBS which really plays to some of these themes and some of the mega trends that are driving Asia. We're pretty clear we want to be an Asian player. What that means is that we are going to refrain from trying to build out large domestic franchises in Europe or the US. That doesn't mean we won't have presence. We have presence in the UK and in the US, but those presences will really be limited to focusing on Asia-related trade and capital flows, as opposed to building out domestic franchises in those markets.
There are plenty of opportunities, though, for banks to acquire stakes in European banks at the moment. So we've seen Temasek get into several banks in the past. Why wouldn't DBS be interested in that?
I guess the answer to that is twofold. First is you've got to make choices in terms of allocation of capital. And if you think about where the best growth opportunities are likely to be in the next decade, I'd submit that those opportunities are right in our backyard. If you look at allocation of capital, even the Western firms are looking at allocating capital out to Asia. So it would be kind of ironic for us to allocate capital into Europe when all of the action is happening exactly where we are. The second is an issue of capability and competency. We do believe that we have core competency which allows us to leverage our knowledge of Asia in Asia. We call ourselves an Asian bank, living, breathing Asia is our tagline. But we know how to deal with Asian cultures, we know how to deal with Asian peoples, we know how to take risk in the deep markets of Asia, and we're not sure some of these are transferable to taking risk in France or Belgium or Germany or Poland. And so sticking to our knitting and what we know we're good at is what drives us to stay in the Asian context.
DBS was the Development Bank of Singapore, and 40 years ago it had that role of helping with development. That's no longer needed as a role, but you could play a role within the development of Asia. In terms of infrastructure, as you've been speaking here.
That is true, we could. And the development bank role of DBS was really focused in the old days more on small and medium enterprise development as opposed to infrastructure development. But your point is valid. We do believe that, and from a DBS standpoint, we have some strengths which are particularly suitable to the mega trends driving Asia. And one of those is indeed that. We think the small and medium enterprises around Asia are going to grow exponentially over the next decade. And our roots allow us to play extremely well in that space. We've also have built a good track record over the years in project finance. And so that's a separate second area where we think our strengths and skill sets will let us participate. One of the big mega trend driving Asia is the creation of wealth, affluence. And once again, it's something that DBS should be particularly good at being able to intermediate and participate in. Frankly, Singapore has done such a great job as positioning itself as what I call the new Switzerland, as the new wealth hub. And within Singapore, DBS has got almost a halo effect. The fact we are 28% owned by Temasek, and therefore the legitimacy of the Singapore government sort of befalls on us and allows us to participate in the wealth space quite attractively. So we do think the mega trends in our region which are very attractive and suitable to the kind of businesses we want to build and the kind of strengths that we have to leverage on.
It was interesting that you pointed out there about Singapore, and Singapore as a safe haven, Singapore as a Switzerland within Asia. And you see the Singapore authorities potentially building on that?
Oh, absolutely. It's Singapore has been doing this very appropriately and very cleverly for the last decade, which is building out everything it takes to be a Switzerland. It's the systems are good, it's efficient, everything works well. It's AAA, it's secure. But one of the things they've done a particularly good job of is married that with a regime which, while on the one hand allows for privacy laws, at the same time corresponds with all of the OECD, US and Western world requirements around foreign corrupt practices, around making sure that tax regimes are kosher. And Singapore's got that balance extremely well. On the back of that has really built up an outstanding asset management industry. So whether it's private banking or fund management or asset management or alternative funds management, Singapore is really beginning to bat in the global leagues.
You made an interesting point in this session that Asia's made a V-shaped recovery, quite a sharp V-shaped recovery. But it's not on the back of exports to the US, and it's basically domestic consumption.
Economists have done this work over the last three crises. So the late 80s crisis, then the internet crisis, and then the latest crisis. And it's quite interesting to see that in every successive crisis, Asia's recovery starts getting faster and faster relative to recovery in the West. The first crisis, the recovery was a very flat and gradual U-shaped recovery. The crisis in between, it was a V, but a shallow V. And then this crisis, it becomes a sharp V. And I think the point our economists make is this really speaks to a fundamental secular shift in the nature of consumption patterns. Asians are beginning to consume more. The net incremental consumption demand being thrown out by Asia every year, this is at the margin, is beginning to really count. In the early 90s, we think that for every dollar that the US threw out in incremental demand, Asia threw out 44 cents. This year, we believe Asia will throw out $1.02 for every dollar that the US throws out. And we see that in our business. There is a lot more. The change in trade patterns in Asia, which underscores that. Asia is beginning to consume a lot more of its own production.
And won't be so dependent on exports.
And therefore will be less dependent on exports. Now, I'm generalizing Asia. There are still countries in Asia which are very heavily leveraged to the US and to the West. Singapore is a classic case, for example. So is Malaysia, so is Hong Kong. But on the other hand, there are countries which are heavily dependent on domestic demand, like Indonesia, like India, like China increasingly. And since those countries are large, the balance of the consumption equation is beginning to shift more in terms of domestic consumption.
There's been a lot of talk recently about currency wars. And obviously everybody wants to keep their currency as low as possible. And on the other hand, one would like to see the renminbi to appreciate. Is it a phony war, though, at the moment?
I think the pressures are real because everybody wants to keep their currencies weak. But fundamentally, if you just look at even the relative value of currencies in Asia, a lot of the non-Chinese currencies have picked up a lot of the slack. Almost every non-yuan currency is appreciated by 25-30% over the last period. That includes the Sing dollar, that includes several of the currencies in Asia, bar the yuan. So I think the pressures on the yuan or the renminbi to appreciate are only going to continue to increase. Now, that having been said, the Chinese government has some real issues because quite clearly in the Chinese context, a 7 or 8% GDP growth rate is the minimum they need to be able to manage the socio-political issues that they have to deal with. And the point, therefore, that if they allow their currency to appreciate significantly, they might not be able to generate that growth rate is a real concern for the government and for the country. One of the things the Chinese government has been doing this year, which people have not focused on very much, is begun a very rapid, focused but rapid internationalization of the renminbi. They've been doing it through Hong Kong, but the changes that they've made in the last 4 months are actually quite mind-boggling. Certainly on the trade account, they're beginning to let people use the renminbi quite freely out of Hong Kong. And they're beginning to also now set up swap facilities with the Malaysians, with the Singaporeans, with other countries. My own view is that they're actively going to look at using the renminbi to create a renminbi trading bloc to try and see if that's a way to obviate or reduce at least, mitigate the pressures they're getting on currency appreciation on the dollar front.
But full convertibility is some way off.
I don't think capital accounts convertibility will happen in a hurry, but there's enough trade flow and trade account convertibility will help reduce pressures.
The IMF chief, Dominic Strauss-Kahn, spoke recently of currencies being used as policy weapons. Is that what we're seeing at the moment?
Well, some of it. Yeah, I mean, clearly in some countries they don't have a choice. Singapore is a case in point. Singapore doesn't have a monetary policy or an interest rate regime. Singapore's entire monetary policy is driven on the back of a currency exchange rate. Also, when you're running out of monetary and fiscal policies and export seems to be a principal policy engine, then currency begins to become a policy tool. So, some of it you could argue is rhetoric. Some of it is really rooted in fundamental economic reasons. I don't think it's going to go away in a hurry.
To shift gears somewhat, the last time we spoke to you, you were with Citibank. That was about a year ago. You've come into DBS Bank, you're now CEO. How would you compare the two corporate cultures?
Interestingly, when I was at Citi, and this might be true for a number of Western firms, though I'm sure I can't generalize, the firms are really focused on individual excellence, individual accountability, and individual entrepreneurship. Right? In fact, the big challenge for me in my previous firm used to be to create a culture of teamwork, participation, shared goals, and shared values. It's a bit of a contrast to the firm I'm at now, where the overriding priority is consensus, moderation, and teamwork, but sometimes at the cost of individual excellence, individual accountability, and individual entrepreneurship. So in some ways, I'm trying to move the pendulum in the other direction. There has to be a happy mean somewhere, but certainly the mean is not where I was and not where I am.
You spoke at Global Entropolis recently, a conference here in Singapore, about the changing role of the CEO. One of the points you highlighted was that you need to have adaptable leaders and adaptable leadership. What did you mean by that?
Well, the issue is really around change. I spoke in terms of an anecdote, which was back at Citi in the mid-90s. I headed up Citi's strategy planning group. And the way we ran our strategy exercise was to try and forecast 5 years into the future. And so we built a whole model around that. Well, come 5 years into the future, the year 2000, I went back and looked at my notes. And the truth is we missed most of the big things that happened in the world over that 5-year period. We missed the mobile phone revolution, we missed the internet revolution, we missed the Asian financial crisis. And as I pondered over it, I recognized it was very difficult for us to have made the right calls. So the real issue is, how do you build in your company and your organization the capacity to respond, to leverage on your competencies, but to respond quickly, convincingly to changes and opportunities as they arise. And the truth is that as you think about the world we are in today and the world where we are going into, that change is happening at an increasingly rapid pace, which means that if you're going to be a good leader, the answer is not in trying to make the right calls for the future. The answer is in building capacity in your organization to respond to change and to adapt to ever-changing requirements of multiple stakeholders.
Piyush Gupta, CEO of DBS Bank, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.